Hello and welcome to another video from thebookdesigner.com. I'm Joel Friedlander, and today I am really excited to have with me Alan Rinzler, a somewhat legendary editor, and we're going to be talking about developmental editing. Now, for the people out there who don't know who Alan is, I'd like you to know that Alan has edited and published books with authors like Toni Morrison, Hunter S. Thompson, Tom Robbins, Jerzy Kosinski, Clive Cussler, Robert Ludlum, Andy Warhol, Shirley MacLaine, Bob Dylan. The list goes on and on. He started at Simon & Schuster in 1962. He was the assistant to the managing editor. Alan's also been the senior editor at Macmillan and Holt. He's the director of trade publishing at Bantam Books. He was the associate publisher and vice president of Rolling Stone magazine. And he was also the editor-in-chief of Rolling Stone's book division, Straight Arrow Books. Alan was the West Coast editor for the Grove Press, and he was also the executive editor at Josie Bass, which is the West Coast imprint of John Wiley and Sons. Now, what you might not know is that Alan's also a licensed California state psychotherapist, and he worked nights for 8 years with the Berkeley Police Department doing crisis intervention. And Alan claims that that's a job that taught him a lot about working with writers. So welcome, Alan, and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend a few minutes with us.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here. I always love talking to you.
Well, that's lovely. Now, I also think people should know, and if you're a regular reader of The Book Designer, you will know this because I link to Alan's blog frequently. He also writes a really terrific blog called The Book Deal, and that's at alanrinsler.com/blog, and I'll put a link to that under this video so you can check it out for yourself. So listen, Alan, when we talked about doing this interview, what it really came down to was developmental editing. That's kind of your specialty. That's what you've done for many years. And yet, in the particularly in the self-publishing world, there's a lot of confusion about different kinds of editors, what they do, when they come into the process. Do I need an editor? Oh, do I need a developmental editor? So before we go any farther, I'd like to ask you, how would you describe to people what exactly developmental editing is?
Well, you're right, Joe. People don't understand the use of the word. A lot of people who haven't written before or are new to the business, when they hear the word editor, they think of spelling and punctuation and grammar and proofreading, which is not what I do and not what developmental editors do. Most successful writers, all those writers on my list and many others, work with a developmental editor. They've been doing that for decades, for back into the 19th century and the 20th century. A developmental editor is somebody who is like a literary collaborator, a partner who helps the author formulate their ideas, sometimes even from before the book is written, by talking and creating a kind of a plan for the characterization, the story, the structure, and the literary style of the book. Sometimes an author may come to me with only the germ of an idea, and it's my job to sort of help them to figure out what they want to say and how to say it. And then every step of the way, after the plan, the first few chapters, the subsequent draft, the second draft, the third draft, working on perfecting that draft, not on a level, again, of spelling and punctuation, but of content and style and constantly revising and rewriting until it really starts to zing and hum the way it was intended in the first place. It's sort of like I use the idea of a block of marble, like Michelangelo's David,
Right.
where the Carrara marble is gradually chipped away, and underneath is the statue.
That's beautiful, and that's very interesting because I don't think that most authors would, if they didn't know that, would think of that they might actually hire an editor before they wrote the book. They usually think it's something that happens later. So if you're really partnering with authors before they even write the book, I think that's a collaborator is really a good way to put that.
Well, they're learning to. I think a lot of self-published authors didn't know about this, but they're figuring it out. And also authors who are trying to go the traditional route and get an agent realize that agents don't want to see a rough draft. They want to see something that's ready for production. And if you want your readers to be ready to, if you want your manuscript to be ready for readers, and you're self-publishing the book, you need an editor. It's very difficult to get there. In fact, I claim that it's actually impossible to get there by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You need that other set of eyes, not your mom or your neighbor or friends and family, but somebody who's going to be kind but candid about what needs to be fixed.
Excellent. So now let me also just make sure that people understand this is both for people who write fiction and people who write nonfiction. I mean, would you see the developmental editor's role as similar in both cases?
Absolutely, yeah. There's basically no difference. In each case, you have either a thematic story or an idea, like in a how-to book or a book of nonfiction. You're faced with the same problems of creating a narrative that someone wants to keep reading. So the criteria is the same. Turn the pages, buy the book.
Get people to buy the book and turn the pages. Well, that pretty much boils it down right there, doesn't it? So that's really interesting. Now, sometimes we read about a content editor, and I usually see that as pretty much just a synonym for a developmental editor. I like the idea of the developmental editor because it tells me that the editor is going to help me develop the book. But are they basically the same thing?
Yes, they are. People also use the expression coach sometime.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard book doctor, which is a little bit, it has other connotations. But
sounds like your book is sick.
Yeah, I don't use that. I like the word
that.
Developmental editor, but content editor is also quite appropriate.
Okay, so you mentioned that sometimes people actually come to you even before they've written a book, but typically when is the best time? When should an author who's, and look, we've got a lot of people coming into self-publishing now. Some of them are actually published authors, but many of them are not. And even the published authors, because they've been through the process with a traditional publisher, don't really know the back end, what goes on behind the scenes. They only know that they were dealing with an agent and an editor, and then bingo, things happened. So when do you recommend that people really start thinking about looking for a developmental editor in their process? Or how would they know that they need one?
Well, I believe in early intervention. So the earlier the better. And I believe that you need one from the outset, as soon as you start to, even before you start to write a book. Mm-hmm. You save yourself a lot of time, because now you're right. In reality, many people, who sort of have the traditional myth of the writer suffering alone in the ghetto, in the attic, waiting for the muse to come and descend and speak, please, and then closing their eyes, and the magic wand goes across the page or the keyboard, and a few weeks there. This is pure fantasy.
Sure.
In a few weeks, 500 pages are ready for the printer. But it just doesn't happen that way. However, I do often get finished manuscripts. Sure, I get finished manuscripts because people have the brains and self evaluation to look at a book and say, this isn't as good as I want it to be, mm-hmm. or because they've shown it to somebody else, maybe an agent, and the agent has said no thanks. Mm-hmm. Or other readers that they respect, so they realize they need to get something fixed. And it's often, to me, I'm really sad sometimes to see how much work, how much time they have spent trying to write this book. And if they had spoken to me earlier, it really would have been much better. It would have turned out to be a much less time-consuming process.
Okay, so that's really interesting, and I've had friends. Obviously, I know a lot of writers, and they publish many different ways, and some of them have been their books have been really seriously affected, usually in a very good way, by a developmental editor. In other words, in one case, I had a friend who the editor asked her to kind of rewrite the book from a different point of view. In another case, another friend actually had the editor move huge blocks around in the book to change their position and then suggest that she write about 50 pages more to fill in a section. So this is like really, big scale construction on a manuscript. And I'm wondering if that's a typical kind of situation that you would find yourself in doing a developmental edit.
It is. It is absolutely. Some of the biggest problems that I see when I get sort of raw, unedited manuscripts are that what should have been written in the first person has been written in the third person, or vice versa. Some stories and some kinds of books generally lend themselves more to a first-person I narrator, and some to a third, omniscient narrator. Another big problem is shifting points of view. A lot of sort of early writers change the perspective from chapter to chapter. So the reader is like, wait a minute, I'm bewildered, and shifts back and forth in time. I'm a strong opponent of excessive flashbacks. The whole technical problem of the backstory is often attempted to be solved by having a flashback. And then what I see so often is a flashback within the flashback, and another flashback, so that by this time that reader's head is spinning. And these are kind of construction problems of shaping and shifting, and the importance that I always advocate of doing an outline. Most writers, when you say the word outline, they think of the third grade, right?
Right.
Mrs. Spellman, their third grade teacher, who says Roman numeral 1, letter A, and that is not really what an outline is in terms of writing. A blueprint for a fiction or nonfiction book is like a storyboard. It's like what you do, what Hitchcock did when he scoped out what was in every scene. And I think that's a very important and crucial way to work, and I always try to get writers to do that, with some success, not 100%. But, if you have a plan, then you can see where the holes are. And as you said, sometimes I ask for more writing, not less. And sometimes I say, well, this scene that you have here should actually be over here, or this is repetitious. I mean, it's just these kinds of problems are exactly what a developmental editor does.
Well, it sounds also like a lot of this has to do with really understanding the book and the reader's path through the book, and really being kind to the reader in a sense, because if the reader can't follow what you're saying, or is confused about who is speaking, or doesn't know when something's taking place, I mean, you pretty much have already lost them.
Yeah, my first boss in book publishing, I was his assistant at Simon & Schuster, was Bob Gottlieb. And he's a really legendary editor. I'm an aspiring legendary editor compared to him.
An aspiring legend, yeah.
And he edited, a lot of very wonderful books, and was ultimately the publisher and editor of Knopf for a while, and is now retired. But he used to have a big plaque up when I knew him at Simon & Schuster, said, "Give the reader a break."
That's great advice.
I took that very seriously. The job of the editor is to put themselves in the reader's shoes and be kind of like, play dumb, like, what did you mean by that? Or, I don't get this, or I'm beginning to feel restless or bored or nervous, or I'm not in a good way. I want to put this down. So that is the job of an editor. And on the other hand, the editor, and this is an important point that I always have to reiterate, is that the editor has to subsume, has to stifle their own egos. I often suggest language. I say, well, maybe you could say it this way, rather than just be vague about it. I actually write, some dialogue or some description or whatever, but I always say, that's just a suggestion. This is your book, and you decide. And all the changes that an editor, offers are simply suggestions, because it's the writer's book. If that's the way you want to say it, okay, I'll work with it. We're going to make the best possible book that we can, but it's your book.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really interesting. Something else I noticed, Alan, and this really connected to an experience I had recently. I noticed the last article on your blog was about the question of writing memoir or fiction. And I ran into this because I was doing a lot of Ask the Pros sessions, a couple of months ago, and and I actually wrote about this. I kept running into people who were told me they were writing memoirs, and then they'd hand me the book, and it looked a lot like a self-help book. So I think that, there's a certain amount, and this seems like something that a developmental editor could really, really be helpful. You've got
Yeah.
a story. The story is one of those stories that just has to come out. It has to be told. But, is it a self-help book? Is it a memoir? Is it a novel? I mean, how do you guide authors through that kind of decision-making process?
Well, I think that my principle is they should do the right thing. They
Hmm.
should do the right thing. What is their passion? Are they trying to save the world? Are they trying to tell their own story? Are they trying to get revenge against people who they think were wrong? Uh, or are they writing a autobiography, from start to finish? Those are the various. We all use our lives to about what we write about as
Sure,
authors.
sure.
Those are the that's the raw material, is what you know most about, and so people have different motivations for doing that. This is where the sort of psychology of writing and understanding a writer's unconscious or conscious motives is really important, and I think that's an important skill for an editor to dig down and find out what's the most important thing to a writer, and if it is to sort of illuminate the reader's life by describing one aspect of their own life, to focus on that, then it's a memoir. But they have to tell the truth.
Hmm.
You have to tell the truth in a memoir.
Hmm.
If you decide you can't really do that, you're going to hurt too many feelings. Then you have to write it as fiction.
Hmm.
And even then, you better be careful if you've got recognizable people in it. I always say that because there have been some famous litigations and revisions that have been required by people who have tried to disguise their ex-wife, or
Yeah.
not very well, because the real motive was something that they were trying to get even with. So it's a complicated question. I think that in each case there's a different answer.
Good, yeah, good point. And that also reminds me that one of the reasons I've often referred my clients to developmental editors is to help them with positioning their book, because frequently they don't really know where their book stands in relation to other books in their genre or their category, their niche, whatever. The other books that people who know that field will immediately relate their book to. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that positioning process, or just understanding kind of like where you are on the shelf with these other books, is actually a pretty important thing for, somebody who's going to then, turn themselves from an author into a marketer, because that's the role of the self-publisher. You're the author, then you become the publisher, then you become the marketer. So I don't know if that's something that comes up much in your talks with clients. But I wonder if you could say something about how books are positioned.
It does come up, and I'd like to preface my answer by saying that being an author today does require, particularly if you're self-publishing, being more than just the content provider, but the idea of understanding the business, doing your homework, was what you're talking about, knowing the field, knowing the conventions and the marketplace of your contemporaries and your competitors, and not assuming that your book is going to be automatically better and different than everyone else's. I often see books that are kind of like reinventing the wheel, right down to the same basic story, the same style, the same story. Your book has to be original in some ways, and to do that, you really have to study the books in your field. And luckily, we have great tools for that now. Not only the bookstore, but Amazon. You can search, your field in depth and see what's selling, see what's at the top of their bestseller list. It changes constantly, but you can get a general sense of of what's selling and have respect for it, because the fact that it's selling, whether you think it's good or not, really it shows you something about what people want to read.
I mean, it's funny you say that, because that's exactly the same thing that I tell people when they ask me this question, and it's surprising to me how few authors actually take that step until it's recommended to them. But if you want to know what's out there, I mean, it's very easy now. It's almost trivial to go over to Amazon or another e-retailer and look at the top 100 books in your category. And for instance, and look what they look like, even, because I run into this a lot with design issues. But look what they're selling for. What's the price? What do they look like? Because every one of those books has already confronted the problem and solved it successfully. They got something that people wanted to buy. So there's a tremendous amount of market intelligence available that we really should make use of. So that's a really good tip on positioning, and I like the idea also that your book has to have some reason to exist. What does it add? If you've just written the 7th book on how to prune fruit trees, probably nobody's going to buy it because they've already got that. Yeah.
Right.
So now, it's also another challenge that self-publishing authors face, Alan. It's really, I totally get this, but, they come into this field. Most people are coming from another field entirely. Maybe they're an executive, or they're a chef, or they're, developed some great system for physical therapy. Who knows? There's a lot of books. But they come in and they want to self-publish, and, they have no idea what an editor is or what an editor does. And particularly, they don't know how to find and hire an editor. So when it comes to let's say we've got people watching this and they're thinking, gee, I've just about finished my manuscript. Maybe I should find a developmental editor. How would they go about doing that? And how would they know they've got the right person to talk to?
Very good question. Well, the headline is track record. Track record. Before you should engage or even consider any editor, it's important to hire somebody who knows what they're doing, and that means who has edited books that have been published and succeeded, books that you've heard of and admired. Now, finding them, there are different ways. One is to search online. You can put in on Google developmental editors, content editors, book coaches, book doctors, and you'll get quite a few people. There used to be very few. The field has expanded greatly because of the demand, and also because the supply has increased since the downsizing and attrition has occurred in traditional book business. Some very fine editors who were my age or younger have been unceremoniously fired, or they say early retirement. People who were really very good editors that I used to work with at Bantam, for example, they suddenly find themselves unemployed. So there's lots of developmental editors around. Also, in addition to websites, you can go to writers' conferences. There's a huge, it's sort of a barometer of how many people are wanting to write books now, more than ever, I think. Are going to writers' conferences. There's 10 or 12 writers' conferences in the Bay Area every year.
Wow.
The Napa Writers' Conference, the San Francisco Writers' Conference. You live here.
Absolutely. I go to a lot of them. Redwood
You go to, and so do I. And they're fun. You meet editors there and agents and writers, and it's a good place to see an editor's face and hear what they say and get acquainted. That's a way. Another way is to look in the acknowledgement page of books that you admire that are on your shelf or that you acquire, and see who the author acknowledges, because often an author will acknowledge their editor, Joe Blow or Joanne Blow. There are a lot of women around, lots of women and men, and that's a good way to find an editor. Then, once you've sort of located an editor and you've gotten their email or however you've found them, I think you don't have to be like the best of an editor, but it's nice to see that they're accessible, that they don't take 2 or 3 weeks to answer your email or your phone call. Mm-hmm. That's really important. I hate that. People in the book business are sometimes notoriously rude. You know, they don't answer, they don't query, they don't respond to query letters. They go on vacation in the summer. That was always traditional among people in the book business. You can't do anything in August, right? Oh, right. Everybody's in the Hamptons.
Shuts down, yeah.
In the East Coast. It's an East Coast thing. Yeah. And so are they accessible? And are they straightforward? Are they quick to respond? And then you want to be clear about the financial terms. This is important.
Yeah.
I would say that any developmental editor who charges $25 an hour is not a developmental editor. Mm-hmm. Developmental editing is not inexpensive. Mm-hmm. And well, similarly, if an editor says in their little blurb or whatever notification you see, 5 cents a word or something like that. What is that? I've seen it. It's crazy. How can you? What does that mean? 5 cents to read it or change?
Which word is 5 cents? That's what I want to
know. Which the word that you add or the subtract? So that's crazy. So here's how I work. Now, not everybody works this way. If I meet someone and talk to them and it sounds like they describe something that sounds interesting, I still can't tell if I can be helpful and how much I can charge unless I actually read what they have. If they have nothing, then we just talk by the hour. And it sounds interesting, then I'm willing to go ahead. But if they have a draft manuscript or something like a synopsis or a long treatment, kind of as they say in the movie business, I read it first, and then I give an estimate. Based upon how much work I think it needs.
Yeah, and I had been thinking about asking you about a range of prices that people should be looking at, but I think that's really a very tough question to answer because books are so different, and books are becoming more different, not less different. I mean, I'm getting queries from people who want to do books that are like 40 pages, 60 pages, and then we've got the other phenomenon: people who obviously didn't have an editor, book is kind of blown out to like 800 pages. I don't know if it's all necessary or not. So it's really kind of hard to put a price or even a range on that. I wonder if you have anything to say about that.
Well, I've gotten some manuscripts recently that are like 1,800 pages. No kidding. 1,800 pages. Oh my God, And I believe that books should be as long as they should be, but there's hardly any book in the world. I mean, how long is War and Peace? It's not 1,800 pages.
No.
So I think that usually, you're right though. You can't really. I don't like to give any estimates until I see how long the book is, and I believe that less is better. For example, I had the occasion recently to find out how many words is in The Great Gatsby. Right? I had just seen this film, which was 2.5 hours long. You can read Gatsby in less than 2.5 hours. It's only 45,000 words long.
Is that right? I didn't know that. Very interesting. Yeah, I believe less is more too. I mean, I've actually got a screensaver on my other computer that says less is more. It's got nothing on it because I'm kind of a believer in that. I'm also, I get asked the same question about book design, obviously, and I always say the same thing. I say, if you want an estimate, send me the manuscript. I can't possibly estimate it without seeing your book because books really are very different. Yeah, that's very interesting. And I know that people who would profit quite a bit from a developmental editor, have different ways of finding editors. I know that some of the editing organizations, like we have Editorial Freelancers, Bay Area Editors Forum, there's a bunch of them, who maintain websites where you can actually go there and put in keywords or, say what kind of book you're writing, what kind of editor you're looking for, and they will come up with a list from their membership. And I wonder if you've ever looked at those or what you think of that kind of method.
Well, I do respect those organizations, but personally, I believe that, and this sounds like a little bit of chutzpah, I hope not too much, I believe that I can edit almost any book. Uh-huh. Any book. whether it's fiction, nonfiction, whether it's something I know a great deal about already. I don't specialize. I love good books.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to waste anybody's time or money if I don't think the book hasn't got a prayer. Right? It's just never going to be worth working on, and I reject a lot of books for that reason. Similarly, I don't do crazy weirdo political rants on the left or the right. And the left has just as many as the right. I speak as an old lefty, but believe me, there's some cuckoos on all sides. Any kind of fundamentalist, religious, political book, I want to work on it. Yeah. So, but I feel like I can work on any other kind of book. I mean, the issues are the same for me. I see the same thing: character development, structure, story, literary style, brevity, economy, clarity, the same problems that I see, no matter what the book is. So I love to edit young adult books. I think that's a very interesting form. It has so much gritty sort of verisimilitude these days. They take on heavy subjects like race and divorce and death. Young adult books, love them.
Yeah.
And I love mysteries, and I love sports books, and I did a lot of how-to books when I was working at Josie Bass. So, I don't feel that I fit into any niche.
Interesting. Well, that's great. So if you were in a field maybe that you hadn't edited books in before, although that might not even be possible for you, Alan, I'm not sure. I mean, would you go and actually do some market research to see what was out there?
Absolutely.
As part of your presentation?
Yeah. I would do content research. I mean, I've been working on some historical fiction, and I had to look up a lot of stuff, so I would make sure the author had it right.
Uh-huh.
It was close to fact checking, but it's also what happens to me when I edit a book is I'm obsessive about it, and I dive into it, and I want to know everything about that world, and I often sort of keep surfing and finding out new things and try to bring that knowledge base back into the book itself in some way, so that I know what I'm doing, even if I didn't know that much when I started.
Now my impression is that you actually also work fairly quickly. So that's just my impression from knowing you over the years and some of the clients that we've had in common. And I was curious, what kind of what's your kind of workflow, or what's your workday look like when you're editing? Do you work on one book at a time, or do you edit for 8 hours at a stretch, or exactly how does that work? Or do you do part of the day research, or what's it like for you when you're deep into a manuscript?
Well, I do become rather obsessed with one manuscript at a time.
Uh-huh.
I have kind of a waiting list, though. I mean, I actually am booked up now until September, which is good because I'm a freelancer, and
Sure.
you know how it is.
Absolutely.
You want to have work down the road. So I'm booked up, but yeah, once I get into a book, I do one book at a time,
Uh-huh.
and I tend to work. I'm a kind of a hard worker. And I go fast.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'm doing 6 or 8 hours a day. I'm working at home now. I don't go into an office. So, my wife is downstairs, and we see each other for breakfast and dinner. Not so much in between.
Uh-huh.
We go for a walk either at the end of the day or sometimes early in the morning. So, yeah, I've been fortunate to, to have that kind of energy still. So that's what it is. I just work straight through.
Yeah, that's amazing. I've done some editing in my past. I don't do it anymore, and one of the reasons I don't do it is because I found that it doesn't mix with anything else. Like when I was editing a book, I really couldn't do anything else. I couldn't work on the design in the morning and the editing in the afternoon. I mean, it just didn't work. I had to have a solid block of time because otherwise there was so much overhead getting my mind back into it again. So that sounds a little similar to what you're saying. And I'm glad you're booked out till September, Alan. That's fantastic because, like you say, we are freelancers and we want to know, that there's something coming after the one we're working on. So that's
the downside of that kind of obsessive engagement with a book is keeping your boundaries. It's almost like when you have a patient in therapy where you don't want to, you need to keep your boundaries up. And so what I do find out sometimes is that when I'm working on a book, it has such a, it's going around in my head when I'm not working on it.
Mm-hmm.
It's still there, and sometimes it's really nice, and sometimes it makes me depressed a little. Like I just finished working on a book, which was a novel about Israel and Palestine, an American in Palestine,
Mm-hmm.
and Egypt, and it was so. I mean, the situation is so terrible in reality,
Mm-hmm.
but just working on the book and then reading the newspaper, the New York Times every morning online, it's just really, it's really disturbing.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I'm doing a completely different book now, on a much lighter subject.
Well, that's great. And that kind of segues well in what you were saying just a moment ago, because one thing I wanted to ask you before we wrap up is, are there things that you see repeatedly over and over again from authors and manuscripts, things that almost like tips or something, that things that people could watch out for? Like, for instance, earlier in our talk, you were mentioning about the shifting viewpoints. Or what are the typical problems you see that maybe it would be helpful if authors knew that beforehand?
Yeah, well, we've touched on a few of them. I actually do a class. I've done it. I did it down at Kepler's, and then book passage, a class in sort of like the 10 top problems that I see over and over again among beginning writers. And one is like not doing your homework, not understanding what's been done already, and not making a plan,
Right.
and not seeking feedback. And then the problem of point of view, shifting points of view, wrong point of view, changing points of view, confusions over time and flashbacks, length, repetition, and then some books I've read and some books I've worked on that have later become very successful had problems with no dialogue, no one talking to each other, fiction or nonfiction.
Wow.
Another book I was working on had nothing but dialogue. It was just like a long series of conversation. That book was by a pretty well-known writer named Irv Yalom, and it later became a best-selling book called When Nietzsche Wept.
Uh-huh.
It was about Freud and Nietzsche. But there's one problem I hadn't mentioned so far that's a very pervasive problem, which is there's a tendency among beginning writers to try to interpret, comment, and explain everything that they're writing,
Mm-hmm.
concurrent, sort of in parallel to as they're writing it. In other words, if somebody says something, sort of giving an aside to the reader saying, he was trying to dig underneath the surface and put the idea into her mind that she couldn't live without him, or that she was dependent on him, or she didn't appreciate him, or some feeling that they wanted the reader to have. And what this does is not only is it very bad and boring writing, but it doesn't give the reader a break. It tries to control the reader's feelings rather than letting the reader have their own feelings. Now, you and I, if we read the same book, I'm sure you've had this experience, we read the same book, and we come away with some very different interpretations and feelings of it. You may both like the book, but for different reasons, because each of us brings our own experience, our own context, our own personality and temperament and life cycle situation or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
to the book that we're reading. That's the hallmark of a great book, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
If you can evoke different feelings and resonance for different people. But the beginning writer wants to tell the reader, here's how you're supposed to feel, here's what it means,
Uh-huh.
and take it or leave it. Not a good idea.
That's a pretty powerful piece of advice, let me tell you. And that happens with me and my wife all the time. I mean, we both read the book, and then it's like almost like we read different books. And that's a joy to me of reading, because then you get to get a perspective that you didn't even see. And, sometimes it might even convince you, maybe I'll read the book again to see what book she read, because it's really quite fascinating to me. Well, this is really fascinating, Alan. I see that we're kind of like coming to the end of our time. I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to leave viewers with, or any other advice, and also to please tell people how they could contact you if they'd like to find out more about what you do and get in touch with you.
Right. Well, I can start with that. My email is alan@alanrinsler.com. That's easy. My website is alanrinsler.com/blog, if you want to see the blog, which is the best part of the website. And I'm just doing a new piece right now about my friend who's having his birthday, sort of a celebratory tribute because he has a lot of good advice for writers himself. Tom Robbins.
Oh, really? Okay.
A wonderful guy.
Uh-huh.
And a real sweetheart. And his birthday is July 22nd, so I'm going to post something in the next few days about Tom. What I would say to writers is, first of all, writers write. Everybody you meet at a party says, I got this wonderful book I'm going to write someday. Forget about it. Writers write.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a real writer, you write because you've got to write.
Mm-hmm.
And the wonderful thing is, and this is what I want to say about writing and reading, is that it seems to be some kind of human, hardwired, genetic component of our evolutionary survival to tell stories, to write, to pass on information and illumination and inspiration to other people, and to warn them, to teach them, to help them, to help them understand what it all means and how to do the best we can. This feeling of people wanting to read and write, it doesn't go away.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't matter what the technology is.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to do it on a tablet or the walls of some cave,
Mm-hmm.
in prehistoric times, or those are stories, or the keyboard or whatever. My friend Herb Goldie still writes longhand
Uh-huh.
on a yellow paper. But however you write, it doesn't matter. To tell the story and then to have somebody read it, it seems to be an essential part of human life, evolution, and survival. So keep doing it. That's my message to all anybody who's watching this.
Well, that's beautiful. And I want you to know I'm going to put links under this video to your blog, and also I'll put your email in there in case people want to get in touch with you. And look, Alan, it's really been fantastic talking to you today. I think you've really helped me understand even better how you do your job and how you make books better for both readers and writers, and that's fantastic. So, again, this is Joel Friedlander from thebookdesigner.com. I've been talking to editor Alan Rinzler, and thanks very much for joining us today. I hope you got something from this conversation.